Okay, let's talk about a pretty staggering reality of our modern world. A tiny fraction of countries basically dictate the global economic rhythm, right? Meanwhile, others are seemingly stuck on a treadmill. They export massive amounts of resources, but they never actually catch up. Well, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating economic framework developed by Oluyomi Oladevid that tackles this exact imbalance. She brings an incredibly sharp, human-centered perspective to global development. Instead of just staring at standard GDP metrics or, simple export numbers, she looks way past all of that. She focuses on how value is actually created from the ground up, and honestly, just as importantly, who actually gets to keep that value. Her work gives us a powerful new lens for understanding structural transformation across the globe. She really cuts right to the core of how nations operate on a day-to-day structural level.
Okay, let's dive into this, because right at the center of her research sits a massive, genuinely urgent question. Why do some countries constantly lose their best talent while others just thrive, absorb all that talent, and completely dominate the global market? Oladevid calls this the dilemma of development. Think about what brain drain actually looks like in real life. It's the brilliant mechanical engineer who leaves their home country simply because there are no factories to build. Or it's a top-tier medical researcher moving abroad because the local infrastructure just can't support their lab. She looks at the global landscape and sees this profound imbalance. And it's not just a wealth gap. It's a massive gap in human potential and global influence. To figure out how we fix this dilemma, we first have to understand exactly how she categorizes the players currently operating on the global stage.
So here's how she puts it. As I think through and analyze the dilemma of development, I have found some ease in dichotomizing economies of the world into active and lazy economies. Now, you might be thinking those are harsh words, but she isn't using these terms just to be provocative or dismissive. She uses this stark, analytical dichotomy very, very deliberately. By drawing such a sharp contrast, her ultimate goal is to stimulate what she calls inward-looking activities. Basically, she wants nations to take a hard look in the mirror and critically assess their own structural makeup. And let's be honest, looking inward, that is incredibly difficult for nations used to the status quo. I mean, it's just much easier to keep exporting the exact same raw materials year after year than to fundamentally restructure an entire national economy. But as she argues, for true development, that kind of introspective structural analysis is absolutely mandatory.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core concept of her entire framework, value dominance. When you have a world split down the middle between active and lazy economies, the active ones don't just win on an economic spreadsheet at the end of the year. No, Oladevid paints a scenario where active economies literally dominate the thought, the culture, the activities, and the global markets. The stakes here are absolutely astronomical. It's really about who gets to set the agenda for the future of the world. The countries that process goods and create high-end technology, they essentially write the rules that everyone else has to live by. It establishes a level of dominance that stretches way, way beyond simple trade balances.
So the mechanics of these two groups are strikingly different. Let's look at lazy economies first. She defines these as countries with little to literally no processing capacity. Imagine nations where the primary economic driver is just pulling raw logs out of a forest or extracting unrefined rocks from a mine. They survive by exporting these raw commodities as fast as humanly possible. And because they don't process anything themselves, they often suffer from what she calls premature deindustrialization. Now flip to the other side, the active economies. Imagine sprawling industrial parks, highly complex supply chains, and sophisticated conveyor belts. These are the nations with established processing capacity. They thrive on manufactured exports and high-tech services. It is the fundamental difference between simply digging a raw resource out of the ground versus actually having the industrial machinery, the capital, and the technological know-how to turn that dirt into a high-value product.
What makes this framework so incredibly compelling is how Oladevid connects that industrial processing capacity directly to the actual movement of human beings. Lazy economies, precisely because they lack those value-adding industries, become net losers of human capital. They consistently lose their accumulated stock of talent to brain drain. Think about it. If there is no high-tech sector to employ software developers or no advanced manufacturing to employ industrial designers, those brilliant minds will simply pack up and leave for places where their skills are actually valued. Active economies, on the other hand, they are net gainers. Because they process and manufacture, they actively build talent and grow their human capital stock. They create value both within and outside their national borders. It boils down to this. If a country cannot process its own physical goods, it simply cannot retain the very people who have the capacity to do the processing.
So the crucial point is that Oladevid absolutely doesn't view these categories as some kind of permanent trap. A lazy economy is not handed a life sentence to just export raw materials forever. Instead, she maps this out on what she calls a continuum of development. This is a highly optimistic, really forward-looking aspect of her framework. It means that structural transformation is entirely possible if a nation is willing to do the hard, necessary work of shifting its internal economic engine. She brilliantly reframes the global economy. It's not a static hierarchy, it's a dynamic ladder that literally any country can climb, provided they commit to the right long-term strategies.
Okay, so here is the exact step-by-step evolution she outlines for moving along that continuum. Step 1 is simply acknowledging the starting point. You have to recognize the realities of being a lazy economy that's reliant on raw exports. No sugarcoating it. Step 2 requires a massive structural shift. Countries must deliberately intensify their value-adding activities. They have to start processing. And look, this isn't something that just happens by accident, right? It requires what she calls concerted policies. We're talking about heavily investing in infrastructure, like reliable power grids and transportation, and funding education systems that actually train citizens in engineering and manufacturing. Finally, step 3 is ensuring that these new, concerted policies become entirely sustainable in their outlook. That's how you lock in those gains for future generations. When a country commits to this intense inward-looking transformation, it successfully transitions out of dependency and evolves into a true active economy.
But let's move to and see how this builds, because for Ola David, simply becoming active isn't actually the finish line. The ultimate evolution of this entire structural transformation is to reach the status of a circular economy. This is where her framework beautifully ties traditional industrial development together with modern, really urgent environmental imperatives. It's no longer just about building factories and dominating markets, it's about doing all of that in a way that can endure the test of time without destroying the very resources it relies upon.
She points out that sustainable economies are much more likely to be circular economies. She defines them specifically as countries with thriving, sustainable, and climate-friendly ecosystems. And that word ecosystems is absolutely vital here. It shows just how deeply intertwined she believes economics and the environment really are. So instead of just relying on traditional, heavily polluting manufacturing, these countries rely on green processing to create their value. Essentially, she's taking the sheer productive power of an active economy, with all its wealth and innovation, and upgrading it to ensure it operates in total harmony with the planet. It's like Development 2.0.
Let's unpack the specific traits she lists for these pinnacle economies. First, they possess highly developed, climate-friendly ecosystems. Second, they utilize advanced green processing techniques to minimize waste. But notice the next two traits on her list. They still rely heavily on manufactured exports, and they are leaders in high-tech services. This is a super crucial point in her work. These nations haven't lost their competitive economic edge, they've just greened it. They are still absolute industrial powerhouses, but they've figured out how to be clean powerhouses. And finally, and maybe most importantly, they are relentless at building talent and growing human capital to create value both inside and out. It's basically the ultimate win-win scenario for both the global market and the human beings actually living within it.
Which brings us to her overarching call to action. She states, all economic agents can work to grow active and circular economies for all. What I love about this is that it isn't just a job for high-level government officials, state planners, or massive multinational corporations. She explicitly calls on all economic agents to participate. That includes local entrepreneurs, educators, local business owners, and everyday workers like you and me. Her vision for inclusive global development requires participation from the ground up. She's empowering every single one of us to play a critical part in this grand structural transformation.
So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a lingering, provocative thought inspired directly by her work. How can we, as economic agents, actively stimulate the inward-looking activities needed to build circular economies for all? Think about that in the context of your own community. Whether it's through the innovative local businesses we build, the specific technical skills we choose to develop, or the sustainable policies we champion at a local level, Oluyomi Oladavid's framework proves that true structural transformation always starts from within. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this gives you a powerful new way to understand and shape the global economy. See you next time.